HR has to also step up. I love what we're doing currently with digital and technology. I do think there's a dark side of that though. So I think HR has to also be the conscience of the organization. You have to make sure that we do these things in a responsible way. And, sometimes you have to ask the question, are we really doing the right things? And what would be the consequences for our people if we go in this direction?
Hi everyone, and welcome to a brand new episode of All About HR. My name is Nelly, I'm your host, and in today's episode, I speak with Dieter Veldsman. Dieter is an HR thought leader here at the Academy to Innovate HR. He also is a CHRO, an organizational psychologist, and many, many other things. In our conversation, we talked about Dieter's journey towards becoming a CHRO. We touched on the role of education and academics. We looked at practical experiences and the importance of knowing the business. We discussed important skills, and we took a sneak peek into the future of the role of the CHRO. More than enough reason, I think, to check out this episode straight away. But as always, before you do so, please don't forget to subscribe to the channel, hit that notification bell, and like this video. Thank you very much and happy watching. Welcome to another episode of All About HR. Hi everyone, and welcome to a brand new episode of All About HR. My name is Nelly, I'm your host as always, even though not as always, I'm not in the studio today. As you can see, I actually got a pretty bad cold, no COVID, but still I couldn't come to the studio. So thank God for the technology, and that's why you are seeing me here now remotely, while a lovely guest of today, Dieter, is in the studio. Hi there, Dieter, welcome. How are you?
I'm doing very well, thanks, Nelly, and thank you for having me. I look forward to our conversation.
Me too. I'm very much looking forward to our conversation. And I think that without a further ado, we can dive straight into that conversation, Dieter. And today's conversation is going to be all about your journey towards becoming a CHRO, what it's like to be a CHRO, and also hopefully some interesting advice that we can share with our listeners. Now, first of all, Dieter, can you perhaps briefly tell our listeners what your journey was like?
Sure, Neely. So I think really the story starts, and I've always been fascinated by understanding human behavior on the one side, and really on the other side, trying to understand how does that play out in business. And, I can remember literally the week before I had to start studying, I changed my course to psychology to be able to understand, but how do we bring these two different elements together? As you've already mentioned, my career started in a corporate setting. I worked as a change analyst in a big global bank. And I think really what I enjoyed about that environment was learning how does a big business function and operate, and how do all these different pieces come together to deliver value for clients. However, after doing that for a while, I realized I wanted to see what does the science of HR look like in other industries outside of the financial services sector. And I made the decision to really join a small boutique consulting firm at that stage to get involved with as many projects as I could, and really just to stretch my own thinking beyond just change management and organizational development, and also started to play really with organizational design at that stage. And, how do we design organizations differently? And I think for me, it was really great, the morning to spend time with clients in the aviation industry, but then the afternoon you're having a conversation about retail, and the next day you're talking about mining. And I think that variety really taught me how does HR apply to all these different contexts, and how are we able to really make a difference, I think, as an HR profession. Beyond that, I then started my own business with 3 other colleagues, and really the intention behind that was to say, where do we think we can make the most impact, and what is the challenging work the way we believe that we can add value? And really joining with them, it was a very, very interesting period for me, running the business on the one side, on the other end, consulting on various things across the HR life cycle. And really, I'm proud to say that, as we built the business out over a couple of years, that a lot of big international companies, as well as really, really small startups, trusted us to be their HR advisors and also to run a lot of their operational HR processes. And that's really something that gave me and sparked a lot of joy for me to see the difference that we were making to the lives of our clients. I think whilst doing that, I also realized that I really get my energy from really being in the thick of things, being in the science of HR. And I made the decision to further my own studies at that stage, focusing very much on employee engagement, a topic that I've always found extremely interesting. And I think it's something that we haven't solved for yet. So I really found how do I deep dive there and also be able to understand what does that look like in a business context, and how do we lead journeys differently for employees with regards to engagement. And post my PhD, I then tried to apply the lessons I learned in practice. So I joined a small tech startup, and really our goal was to say, how do we build different workplaces and bring the science of HR and technology together in this new digital landscape, and how do we play with some of the old practices in a new way? And really enjoyed that, learned a lot about how does technology and human behavior actually interface, and how we should design for that intentionally as part of our HR practices. Whilst doing that, I really was very fortunate to stumble across another opportunity. I was asked and approached to come and help a process around mergers and acquisitions. So 3 retail brands that wanted to reassemble into one group structure. Mergers and acquisitions has always been something that's fascinated me. And if I can give anybody advice, if you want to learn 10 years worth of lessons in 2 years, get yourself involved in a big merger and acquisition process. I think it's one of the toughest but probably most rewarding experiences that you can have as part of an HR team and leading that process for an organization. And really doing that for a while before being headhunted and starting my last adventure before joining the Academy to Innovate HR as the people executive of a multinational insurance business. At the time, the business was at the beginning of a big turnaround strategy. It had been a couple of really, really tough years in the market. And the role was to say, how do we help guide the organization through that? And that appealed to me. Very impactful work, very high priority work for us to get right. And how do we really change the narrative in that organization as well? I joined as the people executive. Later on, I transitioned into the CHRO role. Also then tasked with leading the 5-year turnaround people strategy with regards to that particular scope of responsibility. And whilst you're doing this, I've always been fascinated by how do we develop people, and how do we develop HR practitioners. And, through the work that you've mentioned around writing and lecturing, I've always tried to give back to the science and give back and hopefully, share some of the lessons that I've learned so that other people can utilize them as part of their own journey. And I think that's really what's brought me to AIHR, to say, how can we combine some of the experience I've got? How can we look at the science of HR, and how can we look at the future of the HR profession and the HR professional? I've seen a lot of HR practitioners with so much good intent and so much passion for organizations, but there's certain stumbling blocks that we just don't seem to push out of the way. And I'd love to play a role just in changing that for the practitioner of tomorrow.
Wow, beautiful, really, really beautiful journey there, Dieter. I think what I find so interesting about your journey is to hear really how you've constantly had this combination of making sure that you keep learning and educating yourself, but then also putting that into practice by working in these various organizations. And also, and I think this is a super nice element as well, as you put it yourself, by then trying to give back as well what you've learned and teach others about that. So many elements in this journey that I would like to unpack with you. So I think we're going to start again at the beginning. If we look outside of the formal education for a second, what would you say would be the most important thing that you have learned and that helped you in your role as a CHRO?
I think there's been quite a few things there. The first one for me is you have to stay curious as an HR practitioner. I think HR is one of those jobs, it gets extremely busy. There's always something else to do. There's always a next priority or a next fire to fight. And you have to find a way to remove yourself from that environment time to time and say, let me take a step back, let me make sense of what is happening to me, and let me also understand what's happening broader than my own context, the world outside, try to get into the minds of the stakeholders that you're fortunate enough to deal with, and really understand, from a curiosity point of view, what can I learn from this person? What can I learn from this particular situation? The second one for me that I've always tried to do is, if I don't know how something works, I try to find somebody to teach it to me, or at least somebody that I can observe doing that. And that, was about HR, but it was also broader than that in terms of some general business skills and some general business exposure. I can remember early in my career, one of the things I did is I always put up my hand to say, I will build the PowerPoint deck for the Exco meetings. And it wasn't because I had this, this love of PowerPoint. It was just this love of exposure and what are the types of conversations, at that stage that the senior executives were having, and how can I equip myself to one day, also participate in those and understand, what is important at that level and what are the things that we need to look at and that we do need to solve for. And I think a third one really is, I don't believe HR is done behind a desk. Get out of from behind your desk, move into the business, get to know the people, spend time with the people. And something that I've always tried to do as a CHRO is really to meet with employees that, in the normal course of the day, and a CHRO would not normally interact with. One of my most meaningful learning experiences was with an engineer that looks after our generators in Nigeria at the time, and just chatting to him about, what would he do differently, or sitting with a call center agent, and saying, what's your view on client experience? What is it that you keep on hearing, and how do we really change that? So I think for me, it's this balance between, formal studies, I think, gives you a way to interpret the world. It gives you a way to think about the world, but you have to combine that with, stretching your own thinking and getting out in the real world, getting your hands dirty, and really taking those things on and saying, what exposure do I need, and what do I take out of this situation, and what do I give back? And that's always been important for me.
Get out behind from your desk. I think that's such an important one, Dieter. We recently did an episode here on All About HR with Khurshid Anis, and she also said that when we talk about epic fails and epic wins, what we love to do in All About HR, one of them was that initially when she started out, that she did not necessarily get out there enough. She spent a lot of time with her HR team, and that was fantastic, but she did not necessarily get out there enough to speak with people in the organization, people within other departments, to really get a feel for, okay, what's going on here in the organization. So I think that's a very important one. I think we can continue now. And if I know that there's not a predefined career path to becoming a CHRO, I think that's actually an important thing to keep in mind, because that also means that there's a lot of different ways that lead to Rome, as they always say. But surely, Dieter, there are a few key areas that leaders need to be good at, or excel at even. If you had to make a short list, what would be the key topics or areas HR professionals need to master if they want to become an HR leader?
I think a very good question, Neely. I think firstly, to your point, the acknowledgement that there's no one path. There's no, golden recipe that leads to, the CHRO at the end of the rainbow. And I think that's a very important point to understand. Having said that, though, I've always thought, to be a well-rounded HR professional and a well-rounded CHRO, there's three domains that you need to be good at. And for me, the first one is you have to understand business realities. We talk a lot about business acumen, but I want to go even further to say you have to spend time in the business or living very, very close to the business. So to make it practical in my own career, I've always tried, through whether it was organizational design or HR business partner type of responsibilities, to really get into the minds of, why do we exist? Why do we make money? And what is the difference that we make as a business? And I think that's important for you to be able to understand and apply that reality to the context within which you find yourself. I think the second one is, and it might seem like, a very forthcoming one, but is you have to understand the HR science. You have to understand how the different parts of HR all contribute towards value. One of my biggest frustrations is when HR practitioners get tunnel vision. I'm so focused just on what I need to do. I'm so focused just on what my responsibility is. I forget that I form part of a bigger fraternity or a community, and that all of us have got a different part to play, because ultimately, real value comes about leveraging the different areas of HR at the right point in time, as opposed to just doing the same thing, over and over. For me, to make that practical, it's like being, a mechanic that specializes in the front right wheel of the car. You're extremely effective and valuable as long as the problem is the front right wheel of the car. But the moment it goes beyond that, you need other people to start also guiding and shaping your own thinking. And then the last one for me is really around, you have to understand human behavior. We spend so much of our adult lives in the working environment. And I think as HR professionals, we have to understand what makes people tick, what motivates people, and how do we create some of these environments that's really going to lead towards people flourishing and reaching their own potential. And there's a lot of science behind that. There's a lot of evidence behind that you do need to understand. So really, for me, it's these three domains: know the business, know HR as a science, and understand human behavior. And if you can bring those three together, I think there's a real sweet spot that a CHRO needs to play in.
Yeah, I think so too, Dieter. This to me sounds like let's say the magic combination, if something like that exists. But yeah, I think all of these are very relevant points. And now I want to deviate for 1 second, because there was something that triggered my mind when I heard you speak, and it was like, you need to know what makes people tick. Now, I know that you are very interested in employee engagement, as you said earlier in our conversation. Could you perhaps give an example of how that could look like in practice, a very short one maybe for our listeners.
Sure, Neil. I think it's a multi-layered question, that one in a multi-layered concept. But I think for me, it boils down to the question, why do people work and where does work fit in the context of them being a holistic human being? Now, that might sound extremely theoretical, but people work for different reasons. And if you're able to understand that and able to think about, how does the employer or the organization engage with people in those different contexts for the reasons why they are there, I think you've already won the battle around employee engagement. I think very often we take these generic blanket approaches towards, saying everybody has to be motivated and engaged and involved in everything we do as an organization. But what are those moments that matter? I'm a very big fan at the moment of the employee experience movement, because I think there's a lot of good things that we can learn out of, what are those meaningful touch points? Because ultimately, what is an organization? An organization is a whole bunch of people coming together around a common goal or a common cause, using processes and technology to implement to a consumer. And I think that's what engagement is about. It's about to say, how do I create balance and meaning for people in their relationship with the organization?
Fantastic answer, Dieter. I think you did a really great job because, as you said, it was a multi-layered question and a multi-layered context as well. But so great job on that. All right, let's go back to our red thread of today's conversation, talking about becoming a CHRO, being a CHRO. So, Dieter, another point I wanted to touch on with you is that when we talk about career advancement, it's easy, of course, to focus on degrees and job titles that people have picked up along the way, and then think, okay, I will definitely continue to go up the ladder because I'm advancing in my career. But in the current climate, career paths, they are not necessarily linear anymore, and I think that that's something that will only increase. So in this situation or in this current context, how do you prepare for becoming a CHRO? Are there any particular positions that people could look out for, or are there any strategic competencies that they should master? What are your thoughts on this?
I think you did right, Neely, in terms of, I don't think, like I said earlier, there's one path or one recipe. I'm personally, not a huge fan of very structured career paths to say, if you stay in this role for 2 years, then you will be ready for the next one and we will take you through your paces and eventually, you end up as CHRO. For me, it's always been more important to look at careers as a series of experiences and exposure that you want to get over time that makes you a holistic HR professional or a holistic HR practitioner. And I think you have to almost start collecting these things. And again, my earlier point is saying, in each of these situations, what can I learn? And what is it that I want to take away and put either in my toolkit or in the way I think about the world and what that's going to look like going forward? You also ask, around the competencies associated to that. I think there's a few that you definitely have to kind of have under your belt as a holistic HR professional wanting to move into a CHRO position. First one, I think problem solving. Now, I know everybody talks about problem solving. I think for me, problem solving is really being able to listen and identify what is the root cause of what's happening in this situation and what is it that we can do about it. So trying to almost apply solutionist thinking to real world problems, right? So taking a step back and saying, this is how we can solve this, this is how we can move forward, and engaging with your stakeholders with regards to that. I think the second one, which also sounds extremely obvious, is you have to learn to prioritize. Your biggest superpower as a CHRO is knowing where to spend your time, where you're going to have the biggest impact. And yes, there will always be a next priority. There will always be something else that pops up that is important at the beginning of your day. But you have to understand, how do I protect my time? How do I protect my headspace to be able to understand where I dip in and out? To really have the impact that I want to at that particular level. It brings the point to, you will always be dealing with stakeholders and their expectations. So I used to tease my team to say, 70 to 80% of the role of a CHRO is actually stakeholder management. And it's about clearing and creating a runway for the rest of the HR function to be able to do what they are supposed to do. And I think that's a skill that you definitely have to learn, and you have to foster and you have to mature it. And I think, we're all different. I don't think you should copy anybody else in that, but you should rather learn from them and develop your own style around how you like to deal and engage with stakeholders. And I think that's, something that will never go away regardless of how remotely we start working or how digital work becomes. I think that definitely is really, really a key thing. And maybe a last one there is, I think you need a very strong sense of self-awareness. You asked the question around, what is the career path to being a CHRO? And I almost want to turn that around a bit to say, the question we should be asking is, why do you want to become a CHRO? I think it's one of those roles. It's very underappreciated. It's really, really tough. You find yourself in very difficult situations. But on the other side, it's also one of the most rewarding roles if you are able to understand why you want to do it. And that only comes through self-awareness. And I think in your journey as a CHRO, you have to get to know yourself, be able to understand your own behavior, and be able to understand, why do I do what I do, and how do I show up? As I said earlier, 70% is how you show up and dealing with stakeholders and with their expectations. So that for me is important for you to be able to learn, regardless of what the path is that you take to getting to the CHRO level.
Yes, again, I think Dieter, some super valid points that you make there, both around self-awareness and also around stakeholder management. Now, I was thinking when you mentioned stakeholder management, and I think this is absolutely something that will never go away and that will always remain extremely important. However, Dieter, now I'm wondering, because we are moving towards a much more hybrid way of working, at least in a lot of organizations we are. Some are actually going digital first. Now, when it comes to stakeholder management in that kind of reality, does that, in your opinion, add an extra layer of complexity? The fact that we're not necessarily physically there to interact with stakeholders?
Well, I think on the one end, it adds complexity. Look at us, today, our conversation, in terms of how we are engaging. I mean, that's a very good example of a different channel that we are using still to have what I hope is a meaningful conversation for the audience. So I think it adds a layer of complexity around, we need to learn how to engage in a different way. A lot of people rely on, what are some of the social cues that I can pick up when somebody else is in the room? What does that feel like? What is the atmosphere like? I think we need to learn how to do that digitally. I don't think it's impossible to do that. I think on the other side also, it does provide a lot of opportunities for stakeholder management. It does provide the opportunity to engage with people that you might not be able to connect with. Now, whether that's due to time or location or anything else, I think that's a skill that you have to learn as an HR practitioner and professional. And I think something that never will go away is, why do people engage? We are social beings. On the one side, we do seek connection. And I think especially the past 18 months has taught us that, that we need to start engineering social connection, even if we have to do so digitally. And that then pushes the agenda to HR to say, how else are we going to really engineer this in organizations so that it happens? So I think super important. I think whether we do that digitally, whether we do that physically, I think there are challenges associated with both. I've seen some real great practical examples of people that, just flourish in this digital environment. They speak to people in a much more confident way because they're in a comfortable setting, that they really can be themselves. Whereas on the other end, I've also seen people really shy away from digital connection and saying, I wish it still was that you and I could sit around a table. And I think we need to find that balance, because you're right. I don't think the world will go back to the way it was. I think it will look very different, and we need to be intentional about connection into the future.
I like that one, being intentional about it. All right, Dieter, as some of the listeners may know, and as you may also know, sometimes I like to act if I have a crystal ball and if we can look into the future, even though I think if the past 18 months have learned us one thing, it's that it's pretty impossible to look into the future. But let's talk about the CHRO of the future for a second, if that's okay with you. So we all know that COVID has shaken up the world quite radically, and we're not going to talk about that anymore. But we do see some radical transformations happening in the world of work. Think, for instance, of car manufacturers. They're switching to producing only electric cars, or packaging companies moving away from plastic. So all these require big changes. And leadership, and then more in particular, HR leadership, plays an essential role. This is also something that we've seen over the past 18 months, and there's much more spotlight and focus on HR to also take this role. Now, in a nutshell, because again, this is obviously a very broad question, but in a nutshell, how do you see the role of the HR leader or the CHRO moving forward?
Yeah, I think, Neely, if we look forward, I think, firstly, what a great opportunity to be in HR. I just think, there's so much opportunity on the horizon. Firstly, you asked the question, CHRO of the future, what does that look like? Now, for me, a few things. The first one is, we have to play a role in rethinking how human beings work, where they work, how they work. I think we've been stuck in a very outdated model, and the world which we live in has almost moved on. And I don't necessarily think we've necessarily kept up with that at that particular pace. So I think that is really, really important. For me, the second one is HR has to start playing a role, in the CHRO particularly, in societal issues. We have to apply our skill set beyond the traditional organizational borders. We have to start thinking about what is our contribution towards leveraging HR for good. So think about topics like climate change. You used a few examples there. Think about topics pertaining to poverty. Think about topics pertaining to unemployment. How do we play a role there to also guide society around doing things a little bit differently, and thinking differently about some of these topics as well. The other component that I think is going to become even more important, and you mentioned it around the uncertainty about the future, is we are going to have to become scenario strategists. Now, for me, what that means is helping your leaders and your organizations prepare for multiple futures, because there's no one right answer and there's no one thing that will happen. The world has become too complex and there's too many variables out there. So I think is how do we build that into our own way of work? I think as HR traditionally, we've liked predictability, right? We like the words around, but this is how it works and we can make it more efficient and we can make it better. And over time, we'll do it at scale. I think it is that opportunity that we have to really make sure we help people play in this gray space of not knowing, but being confident that they are prepared for whatever will come because it's well thought through. There are plans in place and there is a response ready, that we can pull at a moment's notice. And, that leads me to the last point is I think HR has to also step up. I love what we're doing currently with digital and technology. I do think there's a dark side of that though. So I think HR has to also be the conscience of the organization. Sitting around the table, you've earned your right to sit at the executive table, but now you also need to make sure that your voice is heard. So you have to make sure that we do these things in a responsible way. And, sometimes you have to ask the question, are we really doing the right things? And what would be the consequences for our people if we go in this direction? So I think a new role for the CHRO, I think there's some of those elements that we've always done that will continue to be there. And then some of these new areas that are emerging. But, get into those conversations, help shape what the future is going to look like. I think it's the famous, Peter Drucker quote that says the best way to, predict the future is to go and create it. And I think that's the opportunity that we sit with as HR.
Very nice one there, Dieter, from Peter Drucker, indeed. Now, you mentioned the element of being ready for multiple futures. So I think this could be a really nice bridge actually to something else I wanted to touch on in that regard, because as a CHRO and also as an organizational development consultant, you have a lot of experience with change, and pretty much everything that we were just talking about is about the change that might still come, that will come, and being ready for that. So if we zoom in on that for a second, I would be curious to know what you think are crucial elements for bringing about meaningful change in an organization from the perspective of an HR leader.
Nelia, I think the first point I want to make there is I think we've long lived in a world where we believe change is done to people and to organizations and not with them. And I think it's a very important distinction, right? You have to work with the organizational system around change. And practically, what that means is, in my view, change is navigated. It's not managed. It's like playing a game of chess. It's moving the right pieces at the right time in response to an environment. And I think there it is around helping the organization understand why the change now, what is the purpose behind this, and where does this fit? The biggest mistake I see a lot of organizations making is not helping people understand where does this change fit in the bigger narrative that we tell about the organization. I think the second point there is change and navigating change is also about the sense-making process. And what I mean there is the organization and the employees in the organization, and especially leaders, have to make sense of what is happening to them and why it's happening and what their response is going to look like. Change will always be tough. Change will always be hard. I think it is important that we help people almost make sense of what has happened and understand what that's going to look like going forward, and guiding them through that process. And, HR plays such a key role there. Sometimes you're the confidant for somebody. Sometimes you have to be the tough voice that says, okay, enough now. We need to move. We need to shift. And I think it's about balancing, those different roles. And for me, the last one is change depletes energy in an organization. And one of the biggest things that we need to take accountability of as HR is to help the organization create a climate where change can happen. Now, what is climate? Climate for me personally is different than culture. Culture is the long-term, who we are, what we do, why we do it. Whereas climate is, what is the mood of the organization where we find ourselves now? How tired is the organization? Is there enough petrol in the tank for us to be able to implement this change now? And building resilience, I think, is one of our biggest responsibilities as HR and as leaders in the future. How do we put these different elements together and make sure that the organization has got enough energy to shift and really deal with the change that is coming?
Now, Dieter, of course, it doesn't just take a one person, a CHRO, to succeed in leadership. CHROs also need awesome people to surround themselves with and to help them with the incredibly hard but also fulfilling work that they do. Now, so you need to build a coalition with other people to make meaningful change happen. When you were a CHRO, what kind of people did you surround yourself with in your team?
I think you're so right, Neely. It doesn't take one person. And I think the role of a CHRO is really around bringing people of very diverse backgrounds and diversity of thought together. And that's something in my role as CHRO that I always try to do. I got so worried when my team kept on agreeing with me or saying, oh, that's a really great idea. We should do that. I think it shows, that we're in this comfort zone where you just have people around the table that actually think the same way and do things over and over again. So I always tried to break down some of the traditional functional silos. In my last role, I had anything from a process engineer to a digital marketer to a data junkie to a clinical psychologist, all sitting within the HR function. And I think they all provided such unique perspectives on how do we really solve the problem for the business. So I think surround yourself by great people that you can learn from. Make sure that they come from different walks of life, and diversity comes in many shapes and forms and sizes, and I think it's great to explore the full extent of what that provides in terms of how you build and put together the team. Often, I think the role of the CHRO is to listen to the people around them and to really understand what is the view of different parties and how do we combine that into the decision that we need to make. Don't get caught up with the traditional functional boundaries that we've always said to say, what this role is in HR, this role is in IT, this role is in marketing. Ultimately, it is about what do we want to achieve. And the more collaboration we can initiate between different sciences and between different departments, I think the better for everybody involved.
Great answer, Dieter. And once again, I think you're so right. But now it always seems like I'm one of these people who's always agreeing with you. But I think we get now to the final part of our podcast, Dieter. And that is the part where I always ask our guests to share an epic win and an epic fail with us. So please, if you have something in mind, and you can start either with the epic win or with the epic fail, go ahead.
Sure. That's a tough one for me, Neely, but I think let me start with the epic fail. I think it was an unavoidable process that I was involved in where we had to downsize an organization and close a part of the organization. And, try as hard as we did at that particular stage, we couldn't necessarily guarantee employment for a lot of people beyond what we could offer as we closed the business down. And for me, looking back at that, I would have loved to be able to walk away from that situation and said, there was a different way of still providing people hope for the future. Because I think when you see that in somebody, when you take away their vocation, I think it's such a tough thing to have to deal with. So, from a fail point of view, I don't know if that meets the definition, but it's something that I wish I could have done differently. On the epic win side, I think I want to use an example of a process that we ran in myself and the rest of the team in one of the previous culture transformation programs as part of the business turnaround that I referenced earlier. We tried to instill this thinking that we called think human first into the organization, which was really around saying at the end of each process, at the end of each policy, at the end of each technology solution, there's a real human being on the other side, and what would they say? And, this coincided a lot with us working more digitally and more remotely. And I really think the win there was over time that got so ingrained in the organizational language that other people started using it. And, I believe you change culture by changing the conversations and the language that you have. And for me, that was a great win just to see how you could influence a business to really take something to heart, which I ultimately believe creates a better work environment for both the organization and the employees. So I think that's something that I'm pretty proud of, that we've managed to achieve as a team in the past.
Yeah, I think you should be. Thank you so much for sharing both these examples, Dieter. And I want to thank you as well for joining me today for this episode of All About HR. It was a lovely conversation. I think we could have easily continued for another hour if we wanted to. So thank you so much, Dieter, for being here.
Perfect. Thanks so much, Neely. Thank you for having me. And thank you to the audience. Really enjoyed it.
Absolutely. Thank you, everybody, for listening. And before we go, please, if you haven't done so yet, subscribe to our channel, give this episode a thumbs up, and leave a review, please. Thank you very much, and see you soon for a new episode of All About HR. Bye.